Patricia Greer thought her son had finally turned a corner. Instead, Tavares lured her out one night, where 4 men waited in the dark. For just $1,500, a mother's trust was sold, and what happened next would rip through an entire community. Patricia Greer's story began decades before the night her life was stolen. At 62, she was a woman who had worn sacrifice like a second skin. Raised in a working-class corner of Prince George's County, Maryland, Patricia never had much, but what she had, she poured into her 2 sons. She worked long shifts as a nursing aide, skipped vacations, and passed on promotions that would have taken her away from home, all so Tavares and Kendrick could have stability. To neighbors, she was the dependable matriarch who watched their kids, handed out meals, and reminded young people to stay in school. Her home, modest but well-kept, carried the story of her sacrifices. Photographs lined the living room wall, one of Tavares in his high school basketball uniform, grinning with potential, and another of Kendrick at his college graduation. To outsiders, those frames told the story of success, but to Patricia, they also told of fracture. One son had gone forward, while the other drifted backward, resentful of the very foundation she had built. Tavares Greer, the eldest, was once her pride. He had shown promise in high school, even attracting attention from junior college scouts. But discipline never matched his talent. By his mid-30s, Tavares's life was defined by odd jobs, short temp work, and debts that seemed to multiply faster than he could explain them. He had spent stretches living away from home, but when things collapsed, it was always Patricia's doorstep he returned to. And though she never turned him away, their relationship hardened with each cycle of disappointment. Kendrick, the younger son, charted a different course. Steady, disciplined, and focused on education, he built the kind of life Patricia had dreamed of for her children. At 28, he was pursuing a master's degree in public administration and balancing part-time work to cover expenses. His achievements often cast Tavares in an unflattering light, something Kendrick never intended but Tavares never forgave. Family dinners turned into quiet competitions, Patricia praising Kendrick's progress while Tavares sat in silence, his frustration simmering. The real divide, though, was money. The breaking point came with his request for $1,500, money Patricia simply would not hand over without conditions. She told him she would help him find steady work, even suggested programs that might support his recovery from the habits he had picked up. But handing over cash with no accountability was something she refused. That refusal did more than frustrate Tavares, it humiliated him. In his mind, Patricia was choosing Kendrick's future over his survival. Her talk of responsibility sounded like favoritism, her offers of structure felt like control. To him, it was yet another reminder that he had failed to live up to her sacrifices. He carried that wound quietly at first, but it grew sharper each time she said no, and each time Kendrick's progress was held up as an example. This was the Greer household in the months before everything shattered. A mother clinging to the hope that both her sons could find their way, a younger son pressing forward, and an eldest son slipping into bitterness. The stage was set not by sudden violence, but by years of sacrifice, jealousy, and the corrosive pull of money. It was during this fragile period that Chantel Moore returned. Once a familiar face in the neighborhood, Chantel had drifted away years earlier into circles that valued fast money over steady work. When she and Tavares reconnected, their conversations were drenched in old familiarity and new influence. Chantel was quick to point out that Patricia held Kendrick up on a pedestal, quick to stir Tavares's anger by painting him as the overlooked son. What made Chantel's presence dangerous was her ability to validate Tavares's grievances. She never told him he was wrong for feeling cast aside. Instead, she reminded him that he deserved more, that Kendrick's success was nothing special, and that Patricia's constant comparisons were a form of disrespect. In her words, Tavares found justification for the bitterness that had been simmering. Chantel also opened a door back into a world Tavares had been circling. People who lived by taking shortcuts, people who saw opportunity where others saw dead ends. Late-night talks with her convinced him that his mother's refusal to treat him as her equal son wasn't just personal, it was a form of betrayal. And for Tavares, betrayal demanded a response. By the time summer arrived, the household felt split in two. Kendrick remained focused on his studies and work, spending less time at home, while Tavares sank further into resentment fueled by Chantel's whispering. Patricia stood between them, unaware that what she thought of as tough love and fairness was, in Tavares's mind, solidifying into a grudge too heavy to reverse. Rodney Rock Samuel had grown up in the same county as Tavares Greer, but while Tavares had once flirted with basketball courts and classrooms, Rock had chosen the corners and the hustle. By his early 30s, Rock was known in certain circles for quick deals, fast cash, and a network of men willing to do small jobs if the price was right. To many in the neighborhood, he was dangerous but familiar, a man who had survived long enough to earn both respect and suspicion. When Tavares crossed paths with Rock again, the timing couldn't have been worse. Rock's presence offered something different, a reminder that there were ways to get ahead that didn't involve playing by rules Tavares felt he could never win under. Their conversations started casually, framed as old friends catching up, but soon Rock was hinting at possibilities. Through Rock, Tavares was drawn back into a crowd he had only brushed against in younger years. These were not close friends but acquaintances tied together by convenience and desperation. Men like Kelvin Rudd, Maurice Tate, Derek Faulkner, and Trevor Knox were regulars around Rock, drifting between odd hustles and small-time trouble. They were not strangers to quick violence or easy promises. To Tavares, they represented a different kind of validation, men who didn't care about Kendrick's degrees or Patricia's sacrifices, only about the next score. Rock became the bridge. He fed Tavares stories of quick money made on short jobs, of debts settled in ways that didn't require begging anyone for help. He didn't push Tavares directly at first. Instead, he let Tavares linger, watching how bitterness made him hungrier for alternatives. Over late nights, cheap drinks, and whispered conversations in parked cars, Rock painted a picture of freedom. No more lectures from Patricia, no more comparisons to Kendrick, no more living under the shadow of responsibility. Each meeting with Rock pulled Tavares further from the stability Patricia had fought for. Rock's crew welcomed him in, sensing his anger and using it as fuel. Tavares wasn't yet talking about betrayal, but he was listening closely to men who measured respect in loyalty to one another, not in family ties. The crew Rock kept closest were men who lived in the margins. Kelvin Rudd, Maurice Tate, Derek Faulkner, and Trevor Knox. They weren't lifelong friends of Tavares, but acquaintances who recognized him as Rock's boy and respected him enough to listen. Each of them was vulnerable in his own way. Kelvin, the youngest, was impulsive and eager to prove himself. Maurice carried the weight of past arrests and had a reputation for reckless decisions. Derek was older and known as the muscle, quick with his fists but easily swayed by loyalty. Trevor, cautious by nature, lacked the conviction of the others but rarely refused when the group leaned on him. Tavares didn't open with talk of betrayal. He spoke in half-truths, framing Patricia as someone who had wronged him and left him with nothing. He told them she had what he deserved and that a quick scare would set things straight. Rock backed him up, hinting that there was money to be made if Tavares got what he was asking for. For a group accustomed to scraps and petty hustles, the promise of cash for a single night's work sounded simple enough. Each man was promised a share. The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was that Tavares spoke with a certainty he had never shown before. Kelvin asked about what they'd be taking. Tavares brushed it off, saying it would look like a robbery. Maurice, itching for action, pushed for details, and Tavares laid out a loose plan. They would wait for Patricia to be lured out, catch her where she felt most secure, and make it look like a theft gone wrong. The less they knew about the full reasoning, the better for him. Roles began to take shape. Derek, with his size, would be the enforcer. Maurice would push the action forward, making sure nothing stalled. Kelvin was to grab whatever valuables he could to reinforce the image of a robbery. Trevor, reluctant but unwilling to walk away, was given lookout duty. Tavares himself would not be seen. His role was to lure his mother into position, then act the grieving son once the job was done. What should have sounded monstrous to any man was presented as routine. Just another job, just another score. But in this arrangement lay the chilling truth. A son had recruited outsiders to lay hands on the woman who had carried and raised him. And the men, blinded by desperation and loyalty to Rock, agreed to follow. The Greer household's years of tension had now spilled into something irreversible. With roles loosely assigned and greed binding them together, Tavares and his chosen crew edged closer to the night that would strip the family of its heart forever. By late summer, Tavares Greer's plan was no longer just talk. It had hardened into a timetable. With Chantel Moore whispering validation in his ear and Rodney Rock, Samuel pulling strings behind the scenes, Tavares gave the four men their moment. The promise was simple: one night, one job, a quick payout that would leave no trails. The plan hinged on Tavares's role as the son Patricia trusted. No matter how strained their relationship had become, Patricia still answered when Tavares called. He played on that instinct, telling her he needed to see her urgently, spinning a story that required her to step out alone. His false pretense was calculated to strike at her maternal concern, the one part of her that had never faltered despite years of disappointment. While Patricia prepared to leave her house, the others were already in place. Kelvin Rudd paced nervously near the corner, his youth showing in the way he fidgeted and whispered to himself. Maurice Tate, restless as always, pushed the group to keep moving, cracking jokes that didn't land in the silence of the night. Derek Faulkner leaned against a wall, silent, his size and posture marking him as the enforcer. Trevor Knox lingered further out, set as the lookout, his eyes darting between the street and his phone. The tension was suffocating. For men who had carried out smaller hustles, this night carried a different weight. They weren't waiting for a stranger. They were waiting for a mother, a woman they knew by name, someone who had lived in the same community. The unease showed in the way Kelvin kept asking what they'd do if things went wrong, in the way Trevor's voice faltered when he reminded Maurice to quiet down. But Tavares's words echoed in their ears. She won't resist, it'll look like a robbery, it'll be over fast. Rock stayed in the background, his role more as overseer than participant. He had no intention of dirtying his hands, but his presence was the glue keeping the younger men from bolting. Every glance they cast at him was answered with a nod, a look that told them to hold steady. As the minutes ticked down, Tavares positioned himself carefully. He would not be seen near the attack. His role was to guide Patricia out, then distance himself so he could later appear shocked and innocent. To him, this separation was the perfect shield, a grieving son with no connection to the violence itself. When Patricia stepped out of her home that night, she believed she was answering her son's call. For the four men waiting in the shadows, her appearance was the signal they had been straining for. The trap was set, and the Greer household's long years of tension had led to this single, irreversible moment. Patricia Greer stepped out of her home that night carrying nothing but trust in her eldest son. Tavares had sounded urgent when he called, and though their relationship was strained, she never ignored him. She believed she was going to help her child. Instead, she was walking into a trap. Across the street, shadows shifted. Kelvin Rudd was the first to spot her, whispering that she was on the move. Maurice Tate grew restless, muttering that it was time. Derek Faulkner adjusted his stance, his size and strength set to enforce Tavares's design. Trevor Knox, the lookout, swallowed hard as he kept watch on the street, his nerves stretched thin. When Patricia reached the designated spot, the ambush began. She barely had time to react before hands grabbed at her, pulling her off balance. The attack was swift and brutal. What Tavares had sold as a quick scare to make it look like a robbery spiraled into violence from which there was no return. Patricia struggled, but 4 men against 1 was no fight. Within minutes, she was on the ground, motionless. In the scramble that followed, Kelvin snatched her purse and a few personal items, tossing them into Morris's hands to stage the robbery. Derek pushed them to move faster, knowing lingering would draw attention. Trevor kept glancing down the street, terrified that headlights or footsteps would expose them. The scene they left behind was meant to tell a simple story: a woman robbed, the violence in unfortunate accident. But the reality was far darker. This was not the work of strangers. This was a mother betrayed by her own blood. Tavares kept himself at a distance, never seen, never touched, ensuring his hands appeared clean. To anyone else, he would look like the son waiting for news, not the architect of his mother's murder. As the 4 men scattered into the night, the neighborhood remained silent, unaware of what had just occurred. By morning, the staged story of a robbery gone wrong would begin to circulate, but for Patricia Greer, there was no mourning left to see. The discovery of Patricia Greer's body shook Prince George's County to its core. For decades she had been a fixture of the community, the woman who showed up to church fundraisers, volunteered at neighborhood events, and counseled younger families through struggles she had once faced herself. News that she had been killed in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong spread fast, leaving neighbors in shock and disbelief. Inside the family, the grief was immediate but uneven. Tavares Greer played the role of devastated son, putting himself at the center of arrangements, speaking with neighbors, and accepting condolences. He shed visible emotion, hugging relatives tightly, and told anyone who would listen that he could not believe such a tragedy had struck their home. For many who didn't know the undercurrent of tension between him and Patricia, it was convincing. But Kendrick Greer, the younger son, felt the fracture more acutely. He had been away focusing on his studies when the news reached him. His return to the family home was marked by shock and disbelief, but also confusion. Patricia had always been careful, never careless with her safety. Something about the story didn't add up in Kendrick's mind, though in the fog of grief he couldn't yet name what. The community rallied, led by Helen Drummond, Patricia's longtime confidant and church elder. Vigils were organized outside the Greer home, candles and prayers filling the night air. For those gathered, it was about honoring a woman who had given so much, but beneath the surface, whispers began. Some neighbors quietly noted Tavares's sudden closeness to people like Chantel Moore and Rodney Rock Samuel, faces not usually seen around Patricia's home. Others wondered why Tavares seemed so quick to take charge, where Kendrick's grief came out in silence and distance. Law enforcement moved cautiously at first, treating the case as a robbery homicide. But even in the early hours, detectives noticed inconsistencies. The amount of property taken did not match the level of violence inflicted. There were no signs of forced entry into Patricia's home, and nothing suggested she had been randomly targeted. The brutality of the act felt personal, even though the scene had been staged to look otherwise. As the days passed, cracks in the story widened. Tavares's performance as a grieving son began to falter under the weight of quiet contradictions. Chantel was spotted around him at odd times, her presence raising questions among those who knew her reputation. Rock, though careful to avoid the spotlight, was seen whispering with Tavares at the fringes of vigils. For now, however, the Greer household was consumed by grief and disbelief. Patricia's funeral became a scene of both mourning and unspoken suspicion, with Kendrick standing rigidly by his mother's casket while Tavares wept openly for the crowd. The truth was buried deeper than the woman they were laying to rest, but it would not stay hidden for long. The first crack came from the people Tavares had pulled into his orbit. Trevor Knox, rattled by the weight of what he had been part of, began distancing himself from the others. Detectives noted his nervous behavior during routine questioning, his stammered explanations, and the way his story shifted each time he was asked for details. His hesitation stood in contrast to Maurice Tate's swagger, Derek Faulkner's silence, and Kelvin Rudd's jittery overcompensation. The inconsistencies planted doubt in investigators' minds. Helen Drummond, who had stood by Patricia through thick and thin, also noticed what others were whispering. Tavares's sudden closeness to Chantel Moore, the way Rock Samuel hovered on the edges of vigils, and the strange comfort Tavares seemed to draw from their presence, none of it matched the behavior of a grieving son. She quietly began voicing her unease to Kendrick, reminding him that Patricia herself had once worried about Tavares's growing resentment. The turning point came when investigators pulled phone records. Calls between Tavares and the four men clustered in the hours before and after the attack, communications Tavares could not convincingly explain away. Combined with witness accounts of him meeting with Rock in the days leading up to the murder, the web tightened around him. When Trevor finally broke under pressure, his account confirmed what detectives had suspected: the attack wasn't random. It had been planned, and the sun was at its center. For Kendrick, the revelation was shattering. The brother he had once defended, even in private conversations with Patricia, was exposed as the very person who orchestrated her death. The idea that Tavares had not only resented their mother but had conspired with outsiders to end her life was almost too much to comprehend. He replayed every argument, every silent dinner, and every moment Patricia had urged him to keep faith in his brother. All of it collapsed under the weight of the truth. The community felt the blow just as deeply. Patricia had been more than a mother. She was a symbol of perseverance, the kind of neighbor who gave when she had little to spare. To learn that her life had been taken not by faceless criminals but by the son she had raised sent ripples of disbelief through the county. Vigils turned from mourning into hard reflection. People asked aloud how bitterness could fester so deeply that blood ties became meaningless. By the time Tavares was formally implicated, the mask of the grieving son had fallen away. He was no longer seen as Patricia's child but as the architect of her betrayal. In living rooms, churches, and corner stores, the refrain was the same: the cruelest enemy is the one who comes from within. The trial of Tavares Greer and the men he pulled into his plan became one of the most closely followed proceedings in Prince George's County that year. For the first time, all the strands of betrayal, secrecy, and violence were laid bare in a public courtroom. Patricia Greer's absence was felt in every corner of the room, her framed photo placed near the prosecution's table, a silent reminder of who the trial was really for. From the opening statements, prosecutors framed the case as a story of greed and resentment. They presented Tavares not as a grieving son, but as the mastermind who used his role as Patricia's child to lure her into danger. They painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy toward his younger brother and convinced that money could be taken by force rather than earned. The most damning moments came from the testimonies of those who had once been closest to Tavares. Trevor Knox, visibly shaken, admitted his role as lookout and confessed how Tavares had promised them money for staging what was supposed to look like a robbery. He described the planning meetings, the way roles were assigned, and the chilling confidence Tavares showed when speaking of his mother. His words cracked open the conspiracy in a way no physical evidence could. Kelvin Rudd, the youngest of the group, followed. His testimony was halting, but he confirmed what Trevor had said: Tavares set the plan, Tavares promised the payout, and Tavares was the one who kept his hands clean by staying away during the attack. Cross-examination tried to paint Kelvin as unreliable, but the consistency of his statements and the visible guilt on his face left an impression on the jury. Prosecutors also introduced call logs and text messages between Tavares and the others in the days leading up to the murder. The timestamps matched Trevel's and Kelvin's accounts of planning and confirmed Tavares's involvement at critical moments. Combined with witness sightings of Tavares with Rock Samuel and Chantel Moore, the evidence created a chain too strong to ignore. When Maurice Tate and Derek Faulkner took the stand, their attempts to minimize their roles collapsed under cross-examination. Prosecutors pressed them on their presence at the scene, the stolen items used to stage the robbery, and their connection to Tavares. Both men, cornered by the evidence, could only admit partial responsibility, which further implicated the entire group. Chantel Moore and Rodney Rock Samuel were not spared. Though they had not physically attacked Patricia, the trial revealed their influence. Chantel's manipulation of Tavares, feeding his bitterness and stoking his jealousy, was laid out through witness testimony and records of her meetings with him. Rock's role as the bridge, the man who connected Tavares to the crew, was presented through corroborating statements. Throughout the proceedings, Tavares sat at the defense table, his expression shifting between defiance and detachment. Each testimony chipped away at the image he had tried to project after his mother's death. Where once he had stood at vigils as the grieving son, he now sat as the accused architect of her murder. For Kendrick, seated in the gallery beside Helen Drummond, every word was a reminder that his brother had not only betrayed their family but orchestrated the destruction of its heart. By the time closing arguments ended, the conspiracy had been unraveled in full view of the community. The jury was left with a picture not of random violence, but of calculated betrayal, a son who exchanged his mother's life for the promise of $1,500 and the misguided loyalty of men who followed him. The trial ended with no ambiguity. Tavares Greer was found guilty on all major counts, including orchestrating the murder of his own mother. The jury, having listened to weeks of testimony, had little difficulty in reaching their conclusion. When the verdict was read, Tavares sat motionless, his eyes fixed forward, while Kendrick lowered his head, unable to reconcile the brother he once defended with the man now condemned. At sentencing, the judge described the crime as a betrayal of the deepest order. Tavares received the harshest penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court emphasized that his actions were premeditated, motivated by greed, and carried out through manipulation of others. For the community, the sentence felt both inevitable and devastating. The four men who carried out the ambush, Kelvin Rudd, Maurice Tate, Derek Faulkner, and Trevel Knox, each faced their share of justice. Their punishments varied depending on cooperation and testimony. Trevel Knox, who had broken under pressure and testified fully against Tavares, received the lightest sentence, 15 years in prison. Kelvin Rudd, the youngest and least experienced of the group, was given 20 years, with the judge noting his role but also his susceptibility to influence. Maurice Tate, whose recklessness escalated the violence, was sentenced to 30 years. Derek Faulkner, the enforcer whose presence made resistance impossible, received 35 years, reflecting his direct role in Patricia's death. Both Chantel Moore and Rodney Rock Samuel were also held accountable. Chantel's role in feeding Tavares's resentment and helping shape the betrayal was exposed in court. Though she hadn't laid hands on Patricia, her influence was deemed crucial. She was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 20 years. Rock, the bridge between Tavares and the crew, faced an even stiffer outcome, 25 years for conspiracy and facilitating the murder. For Kendrick, the sentencing hearings were both a closure and a wound that would never fully heal. He sat with Helen Drummond as the judge read out the punishments, listening to the names of men who had stolen his mother's life. Each sentence marked a step toward justice, but none of them returned the woman who had been the center of their family. The community, too, was forced to confront the weight of betrayal. Prince George's County had lost one of its most dedicated neighbors, and the revelation that her son had sold her life for just $1,500 left scars that extended beyond the Greer household. In churches, at block gatherings, and in quiet conversations, Patricia's name was spoken with reverence, her loss a reminder of how greed and resentment could corrode even the strongest family ties. In the end, the court handed down punishment, but it could not erase the memory of a mother's trust shattered by her own child. Tavares Greer would spend the rest of his life behind bars. His friends and enablers would serve decades in prison. And the community was left to reconcile not only the tragedy of Patricia's death, but also the bitter truth that the hand that guided her into danger was the same hand she had once held to lead across the street as a boy.